Hello and welcome to this webinar from Ian Timbrell, and his company is More Than Flags and Rainbows. And today we're going to be focusing on questions to understanding age-appropriate LGBTQ plus education. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here. Okay, so yes, as Beck introduced, my name is Ian Timbrell from More Than Flags and Rainbows. And in this, we're going to be talking about age-appropriate education. And it is a really important issue at the moment, particularly because so many schools are trying to be LGBTQ plus inclusive, but actually we're not always getting it right, and it's really important that we're open about that. And as we go through today, I'll talk to you about why that may be. But also, we're going to talk about when you do LGBTQ plus inclusion, what do you do when you get those awkward questions that you just don't know how to answer? So we're going to be covering all of those things today. But before we start, I'm just going to tell you a bit about myself. So I was a teacher for about 17 years and a deputy head for 5 years. Taught in schools from very, very deprived areas to very affluent areas, very low performing schools, very high performing schools. And I decided to leave teaching about 3 years ago because I realised that we're not getting LGBTQ plus inclusion right. Actually, although we're trying, the resources out there just aren't cutting it. They're not quite helping us where we need to be. What we're finding is that they tend to be very tick boxy, very standalone, and actually that's not true inclusion. And we'll talk later about how we can avoid that. I'm also a dad. I have an 11-year-old, so lots of this is very, very apt. He is starting, obviously, the changes that happen around the age 11. And so lots of the things that I talk about are very relevant to him. And it's really interesting seeing his experiences going through adolescence in a time where it's very, very different to you and I and how we would have experienced this time of our lives. But now I train teachers and pupils on LGBT plus inclusion and RSE. I'm also a huge Star Trek nerd, and there is absolutely no reason behind that. It's got no relevance to today at all. But if any of you are Star Trek nerds, please feel free to say hello. But after today's session, if you did want to get in touch with me, you can find me on Twitter, X, or Blue Sky at iTimbrell, and on Instagram, Facebook, and Threads by searching for More Than Flags and Rainbows, and at our website at morethanflagsandrainbows.com, and that's at the bottom of the slides. So if you have any questions or anything, please feel free to get in touch if it's about something in your school. And even if I'm not the right person to answer these questions, I may be able to put you onto someone who can. But I run a not-for-profit organisation called More Than Flags and Rainbows, and I founded it about a year ago. And the name came about because I went into a school who told me that they were really LGBTQ plus inclusive, and they wanted to show off all of the things that they were doing. And I have to say, I went in and this is the phrase I use in my training, it looked like a unicorn had crapped all over the school, because everywhere you looked there was rainbows. Rainbow lanyards, pin badges, every display had rainbows on it. There were posters up everywhere. And on the surface, it looked like a really inclusive space. But actually what we realised very quickly was that those children did not feel safe. I chatted to a couple of the sixth formers and said, well, what would you do if someone came out in this school? You know, how are they accepted? And they told me quite blankly, no one comes out in this school because they don't feel safe. And that's a prime example of where schools and businesses actually go wrong, where they do this virtue signalling, where they do all of the easy stuff. So they set up a pride club, they have a pride event, they wear rainbow badges, they maybe go for awards and things. But actually, at the crux of it, do our young people feel safe, seen and supported? And that's the mantra of More Than Flags and Rainbows, is what we want is every child to feel safe in school. We want every child to feel seen for who they are, and they want to be supported when things go tough. So that's our organisation. So please have a look at our website to find out more about what we do. Now, I remember when I was in school and I was sex education and RSE, and, you know, I remember the only thing I remember was in year 7, and the girls were sent for an extra hour in the hall, and the boys had an extra hour break. We went out for an hour, and we never ever found out what those girls talked about. And the rumours were absolutely rife. You can imagine how they were going round. And actually, that was the puberty talk that was happening in school. But that was it. You know, absolutely nothing else. There was nothing, absolutely nothing else that helped us. And what happened is, You had a generation of kids growing up who became sexually active, who didn't know what to do, didn't know how to keep safe, but also didn't know how to keep safe in relationships, not just physically, but also emotionally. And that's particularly prevalent for LGBTQ plus inclusion. Now, one of the reasons that this happens, and one of the reasons why you probably didn't have an LGBTQ plus inclusive school life, was that between 1988 and 2003 in England and Wales and 2001 in Scotland, there was a law called the Local Government Act, and part of that was Section 28. And Section 28 was part of the law which stated that what the government called at the time promoting homosexuality was forbidden. What it actually meant was that schools just didn't talk about it. They didn't talk about homosexuality, let alone the other parts of LGBTQ plus inclusion. And this is why schools are really struggling now with it, because we didn't have it when we were in school. Now, you probably, when you're teaching, can think back to your school life and think about what was great and what was dreadful and use that as a guiding principle in your inclusion. But actually, we don't have that with LGBTQ plus inclusion because you had nothing. If you are a younger teacher, perhaps an ECT or an NQT, maybe you did have something. But it probably still was light touch. So this is an area where we are still learning, we're still growing, and so it's important that people ask questions and really reflect. And also it's important that we don't jump to lanyards, badges, pride clubs straight away, because actually, although they are an important part of inclusion, they don't make inclusive spaces. So the main things I'm going to talk about today are going to be the legislation behind what you need to do, what language be taught and when, how to handle tricky questions, setting boundaries and managing reactions, and also engaging with parents, including how you can deal with a parental complaint. Now, I'm going to be covering all of these briefly, so if there is anything in particular that you want to know after today that I don't cover or you want in more detail, please just drop me a message and I'm happy to have a conversation with you. So I'm going to mainly be focusing on England and Wales, but there is similar in other countries in the UK and the world. So we have in England the RSE or RSHE education, and in Wales we have RSE. They're slightly different names if you notice. So in England it's relationship and sex education, in Wales it's relationship and sexuality education. And the reason that there's this slight difference is that the Welsh curriculum also recognises that sex is part of sexuality and that sexuality is something a bit wider. So that's the only reason. But actually the content of them is very, very similar. But what both of them state is that the RSE curriculum should be LGBTQ plus inclusive, but it doesn't really delve into what that means. It doesn't tell us in year 1 you should be doing this, or year 5 you should be doing this. It leaves it up to schools. And while that's great for flexibility, what it also means is that schools can be a bit left in limbo about, oh, are we doing the right thing? Is this age appropriate? So schools need a bit of guidance to make sure that they're actually staying within the guidance, but that they're still making sure it's age appropriate. And it's really important that you don't do things that aren't in RSE. And, you know, there are some resources out there which talk about things outside of what is in the statutory RSE curriculum. And I would advise against that, simply because you are leaving yourselves open, you're not protected, and there are reasons that these things are in the RSE curriculum. So if you're doing things outside of the RSE curriculum in terms of relationship and sex, you need to make sure that you have a very, very good reason and you're doing it in consultation with parents. But when we actually have a look at the topics in RSE and RSHE, one of the really interesting things about it is that most people will straight away go to things like puberty, sex, things like that. But actually, it's much, much wider. The majority of the curriculum is about things like consent, about friendships, about making sure that we're healthy physically, online safety. Actually, a very, very small part is about sex education. And what sometimes happens when we talk about an LGBTQ inclusive curriculum is we jump straight to the sex education, which of course is only really applicable in secondary school. In secondary school, you need to make sure that when you're talking about condom use, for example, that you don't have the gay condom lesson, you just have a lesson on safe sex, but you are talking about same-sex couples as well. But actually, we need to make sure that all parts of RSE are LGBTQ plus inclusive, and then we're talking about same-sex relationships, for example, in other parts of RSE, not just sex education part. Now, when we look at progression, what's interesting is the way it's slightly structured in England and Wales is slightly different. So in England, it's generally primary and then secondary. So it's very, very broad. You know, you think of a child who's 3 to 11, there is a massive difference. Same in secondary, 11 and 16, there is a huge difference. So we need to plug those gaps and use this document as a guideline, but actually understand of our school, what are we doing at different stages within these phases. Wales is slightly different. It's slightly more broken down, but secondary is still only in one phase. Primary is then broken down into the foundation phase and what used to be called Key Stage 2. So that's broken down into phase 1, 2, and 3. Slightly more broken down, but again, they're still big. You know, a child who's 7 and 11 is very, very different. So you need an understanding in your school of actually how those phases are broken down so that you're making sure that things are taught at an appropriate time when the pupils are ready. Now, what's interesting when we talk about this area is obviously in England, there is the possibility for children to be withdrawn from sex education. In Wales, there's no opt-out, and actually it's far easier because it's no to everything. Children cannot be withdrawn from any part of the curriculum for any reason. In England, that's slightly more complicated. But what's really important to state is that LGBTQ plus inclusion is not necessarily sex education. If I'm talking about same-sex relationships, for example, 2 mums and 2 dads, that is not sex education. So pupils should not be withdrawn from those lessons. There might be specific circumstances. So, for example, I worked with a school recently who had a very high traveller population. And they weren't withdrawn from those lessons, but what they did is they had separate lessons on LGBTQ plus inclusion, and they had materials that were approved by the traveller community to be used. So there may be certain circumstances where children need to have slightly different education, but actually, for the majority of LGBTQ plus inclusive education, there should be no withdrawal at all. It's only option if you're talking about puberty and sex. Now, at the moment, of course, RSE is going through a consultation, as is the whole of the curriculum. Now, it's really important that you do not use the draft RSE curriculum because it is not statutory at the moment. It is still under consultation, and because the whole curriculum is under consultation, things may change dramatically. So it's really important, and there are quite big implications in there for LGBTQ plus inclusion. So it's really important you don't use this. We are still tied in England to the statutory existing RSE curriculum. So as we're recording this in April 2025, that's really important. You're using the one that is statutory right now. So make sure you check that. So we're going to go on to start talking about our first thing of what to teach and when, because as I mentioned, sort of the curriculum sort of talks about this. It breaks it into phases, but it's not really specific. It doesn't say, you know, learn the words gay and lesbian here, learn the words asexual here, you know, talk about this. That it's not that specific. Both curricula, whether you're in England, Wales, just say it needs to be LGBTQ plus inclusive. So I'm going to give you a little activity, and then I'm going to go off screen for about a minute just to give you a chance to have a look at this. So I'm going to hide myself there, and you have 10 statements here. And what I'd like you to do within the primary phase, or maybe it's not in the primary phase, it would be in the secondary phase, I want you to take a minute and have a think about where you think these things should be introduced. Now, they are all part of RSE. However, they're not specific in RSE about where they should be taught. So I'm going to mute myself. I'm going to give you about 1 minute, and I would like you to pop where you think these things should be. Okay, so how was that? I'll pop myself over here so I can see them. It's really interesting to do this with the staff, and this is one of the activities that I do in my training, and it really provokes quite a lot of conversation. You might have found it quite straightforward. Maybe you've mapped this in your school, but chances are you didn't. Chances are you found it really difficult to decide where things go. Now, there's several reasons behind this. One of them is that actually they're up for a lot of interpretation. So, for example, what does the word learn mean? What does the word right mean? How much independence is there? But this is a conversation we need to have. Now, there are a couple here that should not be taught about in primary simply because you wouldn't be able to. And I'll show you an example in a bit of how this has been taught badly. So, for example, intersex and asexual, you can't describe really what intersex or asexual is in primary school because we don't cover the topics needed to explain them. So, for example, intersex, you need to understand the difference between sex and gender. You need to understand that sex is determined generally by hormones, chromosomes, and your genitals. We don't cover that in primary. So actually, if we're not covering that, you're not able to explain intersex in a way that makes sense to the pupils. What you're going to have to do is simplify it down so far that you'll introduce misconceptions. Same with asexual. To be able to talk about asexuality, you have to talk about sex drive. Well, actually, we don't talk about sex drive in primary school, or we shouldn't. It is not in the RSE curriculum to be talking about that at all. So we wouldn't talk about those in primary simply because you cannot do it without introducing age inappropriate conversations. Now, transgender non-binary is the more challenging one. Probably year 6 pupils are on the cusp of learning about that. Now, my advice to you is I wouldn't plan it in as a specific lesson. However, don't be afraid of talking about it if it comes up in conversation. But I wouldn't have specific lessons on teaching about transgender identities and non-binary identities. Because although children gain an understanding of what gender is from about 3, that doesn't mean they understand the difference in sex and gender. And if they don't understand the difference in sex and gender, they can't fully understand what being transgender and non-binary is. What's most important is that we create a space in primary schools where pupils are able to explore their identity, feel that they can be who they are, but they don't have to attach a label to it, because sometimes labels can be restrictive and sometimes labels can be helpful, but actually if we introduce them too early, some young people may feel that actually those labels are actually holding them back from exploring who they are. So just a few more about them. I don't care really where boys and girls learning about menstruation and period products goes, but I would say it should go in the same year group, wherever you put it. If we're talking about things like writing stories of 2 mums or dads as characters, it's always hilarious where I do this with schools and every time they put in year 1 and 2 normally. And then I ask them, but when have you done it? And I've, to this day, have only had one school who's ever turned around and said, oh yeah, we all wrote a story with a character with 2 mums and 2 dads. Because some people say, yeah, but we create an inclusive space where our children are allowed to do it. Yes, absolutely. I'm not saying that that's not the case. But actually, what in my experience and through research that I've done has shown is that unless children are given specific sort of freedom to do that, they won't, because they won't go against the cultural norms of writing about a mum and a dad. So actually what we need to do sometimes is specifically write that to give them that opportunity. So it is a really interesting activity to do with your staff. Give them different types of statements and see where they put them and have that conversation as staff. Now, what I wouldn't do is necessarily have these written down in a restrictive, rigid curriculum, because actually what we need to do, although we need to have a conversation about this in our school, we need flexibility depending on a year group. So particularly with things like transgender, non-binary, I taught different year 6s where one year group I did it simply because one of the children in my class, her brother was transitioning, so actually we all talked about what that meant. Other year groups weren't ready for it and didn't need it. So certain things where they're on the cusp between primary and secondary, we need to have that flexibility. So that's really important. Now, there are loads of maps out there to help you. So you may have your own map, and I work with a lot of schools to write their own map. But also, Jigsaw obviously has guidance of the year groups or the ages this should be taught in. And why I say this is this can be a really important minimum level. You should never ever go before these age groups. So for example, if we've got age 5 to 6, you might decide not to do them until year 1 or 2. You might decide to do them later on. That's absolutely fine. I would just say never ever go younger, because that's really important, because you could then be at risk from teaching age inappropriate things. They're probably not going to be ready. But these resources can be really helpful as a minimum expectation, but it is absolutely fine as well for you to go, do you know what, this class aren't ready for that yet, or this group aren't ready for that, let's push that back. It's always better to push it a little bit later in certain topics and do it when they're developmentally ready. And I'm just going to, before we go on to talk about a few more things, I just want to talk about actually the age appropriate. Is it appropriate? I actually don't like the phrase age appropriate, because I think what it does is it assumes that every child is ready for these conversations at the same time. For example, every child is ready to talk about LGBT inclusive sex education at the same time. Are they? Is every child ready for that at the same time? They're absolutely not. You know, I know many children who I've taught who are definitely not ready at certain times, and other children that have been ready much earlier. So I actually, you know, talk about this. So imagine 3 children. I got Oliver, who's born on the 31st of August. Max is born a day later, but is in a completely different year group. So even though he's only 1 day younger, he's going to learn things a year later, essentially. And then you got James, who's born a whole other year after, who's going to learn the same as Max, even though they're actually a year apart. And this is where we have to be very, very careful with pigeonholing year groups to go, well, they're all going to learn the same thing. Because if you've got summer and autumn born children, they potentially could be a year apart. So we have to really think about that when we're planning these activities. Think about your cohort. Are they ready for it? And when in the year do you teach it? So I actually prefer the term stage appropriate. Stage appropriate, I think, makes far more sense. You know, age appropriate is only an estimate, particularly when we're talking about introduction of puberty and things like that. I prefer stage appropriate, particularly if you're teaching in a PRU or you are teaching in a special school. You'll be very well aware of this. Actually, there are certain things that they're not going to be cognitively ready for. Now, there are certain things that we can't push back till too late. So, for example, the content of puberty, they're going to go through it when they go through it. However, what we can do to make sure it's stage appropriate is really think about, well, what are we using? What books are we using? And particularly when we're talking about LGBT inclusion, if you are talking about things around gender especially, it's really important you consider the stage of the child. Are they actually ready for the resource that you're going to use? So think about their age and physically where they are, but also think about their stage and what resources you use to make sure it's appropriate for that child. Now, what are we actually talking about, though? When we're talking about LGBTQ plus inclusion, what are we actually teaching? Are we teaching how to be gay? Absolutely not, although social media would tell you otherwise. And, you know, I really talk about LGBTQ inclusive education in 2 sort of tunnels, express teaching and representation. Now, I consider express teaching where you're teaching about diversity, you're teaching about LGBTQ plus inclusion. So, for example, using a book such as My Daddies, which is teaching children that some children have 2 daddies, or using a book such as this, teaching about what does the word lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, etc. mean. Those to me are express teaching lessons using textbooks. These to me are textbooks because they are aiming to teach you something. We also, on the hand, then have representation. So this is one of my favourite stories, which is the Rainbowsaurus, where these children walk at the back of a dinosaur and learn all colours and animal noises. There is no mention of it being LGBTQ plus inclusive, but if you look at the pictures, the characters have 2 dads. But it's not part of the story, it is just there. And that, to me, is true LGBTQ plus inclusion, where actually the LGBTQ plus people are part of the world. They don't need to be taught about. Because I think the problem with teaching about something is then you show it's different. You show it's something that needs to be talked about. Now, I'm not saying that these express teaching books aren't needed, but actually, if we want to move to a truly representative curriculum, they should just be present. When we've got 2 dads, we don't need to teach that some families have 2 dads. And if you do this young enough, children will just accept it. They don't need to be taught about it. So think about your curriculum. Are your LGBTQ plus inclusive lessons pigeonholing? Are they boxed? Are they assemblies and specific lessons about LGBT people? Because that's not really representation and it's not really inclusive, although it is better than nothing. And what we want is a balance between these two approaches. Now, one of the ways we can really think about how inclusive our curriculum is by using the protected characteristics, because we can really think about the books we use and the role models we use. But these are a bit too many, and some of them aren't really relevant to education. So what I've done is that I've put them into 6. So race, visible disabilities. So for example, wheelchairs, hearing aids, limb differences, non-visible disabilities, ADHD, autism, stammers, things like that. Religion, this is always an interesting one, because when I say, have you got religious inclusive texts? I go, yeah, we got a book on Ramadan, we've got a book on Easter, things like that. They're teaching texts, they're textbooks. Have you got books in your curriculum? Are you learning about people, for example, who are Hindu, who are just characters or role models, but you're not learning about Hinduism? And thinking about that is always an interesting one to think about. But also, you know, particularly here, we're talking about same-sex parents and LGBT role models. Think about where you're talking about them. Are you talking that only about lessons that are only about their sexuality and their identity, or do you have LGBTQ plus inclusive characters that are just living? One of my favourite stories is The Last Firefox by Lee Newberry, where a character is going on the hunt for the last firefox. It's casually mentioned at the beginning that he has 2 dads. It's not really referenced throughout the whole story. That is true inclusion, because they are just part of the world. So have a think about that. Have a think about the books that you use. And this can be a really interesting, in More Than Flags and Rainbows, we use this model to help schools see how inclusive their books are. What we've also got that you can use is a diverse book list. So on our website, if you are struggling to find books that are inclusive, if you go to the diverse book list, you can search by characteristic, by age group, and if you're in Wales, you can also search for Welsh language books there. So, and if there are any topics, for instance, someone messaged me a little while ago and said she couldn't find any books with characters with port wine stains, and she had a girl in her class who had a port wine stain on her face. And I've managed to find them and I added them to the list to other schools. So I like a challenge. If you can't find a topic that you want to find inclusive books for, just give me a shout. But one of the ways we need to think about introducing and talking about LGBT role models is how we talk about them. And actually, how do we introduce them? And what we want to avoid at all costs is the gay lesson, where what we do is we put pictures of 3 gays and we talk about them, and then we talk about that they're gay, and then we learn about them. Because what that's doing is it's pointing out to the children and young people, these are different people. They are different to the rest of society. Now, I went into a school a little while ago, and it was an absolutely amazing topic. They changed their topic from champions to silver medalists, and I love that. And they introduced this role models lesson, and they talked about Ardea Depitan, who is a wheelchair basketball player. They looked at all of his statistics. They learned about Tom Daley, who's gay. He's married to a man. He's a diver. And they looked at all of his times and his scores and things like that. And they looked at Amber Rutter, etc. They looked at all these silver medalists. And did you notice what I did through there? I just dropped into conversation that Tom Daley was gay and married to a man. It was not the focus of my conversation. It was not the focus of the lesson, but I have dropped in that he is. Him being gay, married to a man, is just part of our world. It is not a gay lesson, but what I'm not afraid to do is talk about that language. I'm not afraid to say it. That's how we get inclusion, is by not being afraid to show that these people exist, that they are part of our world. But the only way you can do that is if these role models, and this is true for all of the protected characteristics, are these role models part of your planning so that actually you can make sure there are opportunities to talk about them. So it can be a really good exercise for you as a school to actually, from nursery to year 6, or if you're in secondary, look at the different subject areas, write out the role models you learn about. What are their protected characteristics? And I'm also not saying that every role model has to have protected characteristics. Not every book has to have protected characteristics. I loved teaching with George's Marvellous Medicine and learning about Roald Dahl. And Roald Dahl was in many ways a dreadful person, but still is a really important person in British literature. So it's really important that we don't feel that we have to tick a box with every book and character, but at the same time, we should make sure that the ones we learn about are representative of our world. So, really thinking about primary and secondary, what I want to see between age 0 and 7, as soon as they start school, it's representation, representation, representation. I do not need to have specific lessons introducing language. I may drop in the word gay and lesbian if it's needed, but I will do that in terms of parents. And if a child says to me at any point, oh, well, what does gay mean? I'll say, well, some children have two dads. Their dads love each other. That means they're gay. That's it. That's all we need to do at this age, is talk about that. A friend of mine is bisexual, and a child happened to say to him, overhear a conversation, said, what's bi? And what he said was, the answer was lovely, was that he loves men and women and just hasn't decided who he's going to marry yet. And I thought that was a really lovely way for primary children to learn about what bisexuality is. But age at 8 to 11, then, I would be introducing that language, but I would do it in the way that I've just done. Please, no gay lessons. Make sure that you're introducing them through things like books and role models, so they are just part of our world. Now, in secondary, that's going to change slightly, because you probably have a specific RSE curriculum, and they will then learn about identity. They need to learn about safe sex, whatever relationship you're in, but they also need to learn about relationships and the dynamics of relationships. So in secondary school, you are going to have specific lessons on these areas, but it's also important that you also have those representative people and books used throughout the rest of the curriculum as well. Now, this is what we want to avoid really when we're talking about primary schools. And I just want you to have a look at this activity. I mean, one, there's the term, there's the definition, the example. One, it is dull as dishwater and a really bad activity from a pedagogy perspective. Children do not learn vocabulary in this way, so please don't do it like that. But also, it's wrong. So at the bottom, you can see asexual. Some people are not attracted to anyone and would rather be single. And this hasn't been corrected by the teacher. And the problem is that they wanted to avoid talking about sexual attraction, so they slightly, simplified it. But this is wrong. That's not what asexuality is. It's more similar to aromanticism. So someone is aromantic, doesn't have romantic feelings. And so actually, I would question, if you can't explain it in an age-appropriate way, why are you introducing it at all? So it is better to leave it till when you can explain it in an age-appropriate way. But also, please don't do this type of activity. It's really bad teaching and learning. So please don't do it. We need to introduce these terms in context through real life things like role models and books. It's the best way to go. So ask these questions when you go back to school, thinking about how diverse are the role models in your topics, and how do you know? If you're teaching year 2, do you know what role models year 1 and year 3 are learning, to make sure that every child is represented by the time that they leave your school? And the same in secondary, working across your subjects. And of course, in certain subjects, it is far easier than others. In history, in geography, in literacy, and RE, it's much easier than maths. So you don't put the same expectations on every subject, but every subject needs to see where they can make this work. And think about the text you use as well, particularly in English. Is there diversity from the beginning to the end of the school? Not every text has to have diverse characters in, but by the end, every child should be represented in the text that you use. So we're just going to have a quick look at answering challenging questions, because you may get some challenging questions that come through in these topics. And, the reasons that they ask these difficult questions, some kids are testing boundaries, and I absolutely know they do. I taught year 6 for years, and summer term year 6, they definitely test those boundaries. But some are generally curious and may ask in very insensitive or, politically incorrect ways. And we need to make sure that we're not chastising them for genuine curiosity if they get something wrong or they put something in a way that's not acceptable. What we need to do is have a conversation on how they could have rephrased it. But also they may be getting misconceptions from elsewhere, and it's not their fault that they're seeing this on social media. So we need to make sure that if they have been taken in by misconceptions, that we're sensitive about that. But actually, we need to create a culture where they are happy to ask any questions. And one of the best ways for them to do that, if they're not doing it out loud, is anonymous question boxes. And what I always say to children when I'm doing anonymous question boxes is, I will look at every question. And if I cannot answer a question, I will always explain why. That is really important, that you don't just dismiss a question, because that child will be sat there thinking, well, why do I bother? If you can't answer a question, explain to that young person why it's not the appropriate lesson for it. I'll have a chat with that person individually. Something we're going to cover elsewhere. I don't understand the question. Make sure you give the reasons why you're not answering them. But this is a good framework for you if you do get a question that's challenging, maybe you're not expecting. First of all, acknowledge it. Thank you for that question. That's a great question. Well, that's really interesting. I like that. You may need to clarify. So if you're reading a question or someone's like, I'm not sure, what do you mean by that word? Can you give me an example? Can you think of an anonymous example that would help me? You may need to do that, may not, but it's actually fine to clarify questions. It's better that you answer the actual question rather than guessing. But answer very simply, don't go into lots of stories. Answer fact. It's not about your opinions. It is about facts, and make sure that it's simple and straightforward. It may be that some questions you cannot answer in that lesson, and it is absolutely fine to say, do you know what, I'm not sure how to answer that question this very moment. I'm going to come back to you, but make sure you do. Don't get yourself into a pickle because you answer a question inappropriately because you're not sure how to answer it. But always acknowledging it, make sure you're answering very simply and factually. Never be afraid to say, look, we'll be covering this in a later date, or look, I'm going to have a look at this and I'll get back to you. That's absolutely fine as well. And these are the type of questions that you may be asked, such as, can you be born gay? I'd be very factual about that. No, gay people are made. Actually, there has been evidence found for certain genes that cause homosexuality. It's the way people are born. It's not a choice. It's important that we say that. Why do some people have two mums and two dads? You can talk about adoption. You can talk about fostering, things like that. Is transgender the same as being gay? No, it's not. But some transgender people may be gay. So this is an example where you talk about the definitions of the two of them. Why do we have to learn about this? Talk about inclusive spaces, talking about making everyone feel that they're safe. Be very honest about it, but be very factual. Avoid talking about your own experience. And it's really important that you tackle misconceptions head on. If you do get disclosures, and hopefully you won't during this time, but it can happen. It's happened to me when I've been working in schools. It is just really important that you follow your safeguarding policy. So if you do have a question that comes out in these lessons, make sure you write down and report who said it, who did they talk about, what exactly did they say, where were you when it said. It's really important. But never, ever, if a child says anything that, contradicts your safeguarding policy, always make sure you report it. Okay, so last thing we're going to cover is working with parents, because sometimes if you become a really LGBTQ plus inclusive school, you will get parents challenging you on it. Now, these are the type of things that I've seen said to me. I've had a parent say to me that we're teaching 3-year-olds to have sex. No, we're not. That teachers know about sex abuse and are hiding it. I mean, it's one of my favourite ones, but, RSE framework might as well teach about unicorns, because we were talking about gender in a year 8 class. Gender ideology is damaging children. The RSE code promotes the use of sex toys and bondage. Porn is being promoted in schools, and maths lessons must be queered. Every lesson must have a gay in it. And of course, none of these are true. This is not true at all. No one is promoting porn, but what we do, we talk about it in secondary school, because young people need to know what to do when they see it, and the fact it doesn't represent healthy relationships. No one is teaching about sex toys and bondage. But why are they thinking these things? And all these are ways, they're anti-LGBT. They're hidden in the guise of safeguarding, but they always have the root of anti-LGBTQ plus inclusion. Now, the reason that they think these things is some of the things they see. This is an example of a leaflet that was sent out in North Wales, was posted through loads of people's letterboxes. I was saying things like, we're teaching masturbation to 4 to 6-year-olds. Well, that's not happening. There's no evidence of it. There's nothing in the curriculum. So these people are seeing these things on social media and thinking it's real. Part of the reason is that they didn't have sex education in school, so they don't know what actually is going on in schools. But there are some schools who are not sharing resources with parents, and this is where this type of misinformation really lives, is if you don't share. And what I would say all the time is, always offer to parents that they can look at any resources you do in school, but invite them in, look at them in school with you. That's really important, so you can give them the full story. You can talk them through it and explain it. That's the only way that we're going to tackle this information. But we have to be realistic that actually our parents are seeing this stuff. Things like this. Sex education is suspended in Isle of Man after a drag queen tells speaker that 11-year-olds there are 73 genders. What we actually found out afterwards that didn't happen. It was complete lies that were spread on social media. But it was a huge drama for the Isle of Man school. So, this lies are seen online. This information is still happening. So it's important we tackle that with transparency and honesty, bringing the parents in and talking to them. Now, if you do get complaints, what can happen, what can really help is if you have a clear structure for dealing with these complaints. So these are the type of things, and this is an activity I do with schools. I give them several ones and pick out actually how would you answer all of these questions, whether they're saying, please take my daughter out any lessons that gay people in, I don't want my children exposed to these books, etc. But actually what we can do is have a script to follow so that actually we can collect ourselves and not react in a way that actually is going to escalate the situation. So I would use this type of script. So, for example, you've told me that you don't want your child to read any books with gay people in. Well, our school values are that we're inclusive and that we welcome everyone in our community. We learn about this book because we've got some children with same-sex parents in our community, and it's important they feel represented. If you want to talk about this in more detail, please book an appointment at the office. And if they come back at you more, you just repeat yourself, and you always end with, if you want to talk about this in more detail, book an appointment at the office. And what you can do then, they can book an appointment. 99% of the time they won't, but actually then you can report to senior leaders who can really think through what they're going to say, sit down, show evidence to those parents and allay their fears. But don't get into an argument on the doorstep of your classroom. It's what that person wants, and you're never, ever going to win. So this script can be really helpful, particularly if you're new to teaching. It can be really helpful for support staff as well, to make sure that you're consistent in your responses in your school, because you don't want to get dragged into a debate. So I'm just going to finish off with some resources that may be helpful for you. So at More Than Flags Rainbows, we are about to launch the More Than Flags Rainbows Academy, which is an online training platform for schools, including a webinar by Jigsaw that has training on all aspects of inclusion. And we're also holding some free webinars on this. So if you want to find out more about that, just get in touch. There's also the PSHE Association that has loads of quality resources, and you can join as a member school and get loads of additional resources on PSHE. You've also got the Sex Education Forum, which has resources particularly around that sex education to support your Jigsaw resources. You may need some other things to add on, but it also has staff training. And I also write lots of blog posts on there. So all these things can really enhance your experience with the Jigsaw resources, can really help you, highly train your staff to make sure that we're delivering a really inclusive and detailed curriculum. And I've also mentioned the diverse book list as well. But as I said, if there's anything that you want to get in touch with, please do. I hope that today has been helpful, that it'll give you some things to think about. And if you did want to get in touch with me for any training or just pass anything by, please get in touch. But thank you for watching and listening and making our schools more inclusive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. That was lots of food for thought, and hopefully everybody's going to go back to their schools and have an audit to see which books they've got for representation. Thank you. That was really, really interesting. Thank you, everyone.